All right, welcome everyone to a new series for our Segment 1 classes. A couple of things. Welcome to all of our new associates who took advantage of our winter promotion. We appreciate you wanting to study with us here at EAN. And if ever you cannot attend class live, still register when the email notice comes out, because if you actually register for the class, then the webinar service will send you a link directly to your email box when the class has been posted on our website. Second way you find it, you can always go log into your account on our website and you can do a word search, planetary pair, and this class will come up. In your materials, whether you got a binder or whether you're looking at PDFs, there's a PDF for all the audio classes that I taught. I taught a monthly audio class from 2003 through 2013. And then there is a second PDF of all the webinar PowerPoint classes that we have taught on a monthly basis. Those started in 2014. And I do recommend, in addition to the DVDs/streaming videos, I do recommend that you start with those webinar classes back in 2014 and work your way through up to 2021. And that'll give you another refresher from the beginning of EA, starting with its philosophy through the planetary method with Pluto and the nodes. And then, of course, all of these various continuing ed classes that we are continuing to do.
Kim,
Now,
just one clarification hearing you speak, and you said, please do, whenever you go to the website as a registered associate, log into your account first, because that search that you referred to, in this case, the planetary pair keyword, what will happen is then the website recognizes you as a student. If you don't log in, they'll try to sell you. They'll try to sell you something. You know, we have planetary pairs information throughout the website, but you want to get to your registered associates area of the website, and that is on that account page. It's a green banner that says click here for registered associates access. You click on that, there's going to be a blue hyperlink to all the content. So that was the missing step, Kim. I just wanted to be clear about for the new people.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that, honey. Okay, enough housekeeping. If you have any technical questions or any trouble getting to anything, you can always send us an email. Leroy handles the techno stuff, which I appreciate very much. So moving forward, what we are going to work with in this series of planetary pairs with the planet Pluto, everything in evolutionary astrology is in a cycle of becoming. And so here is the visual that we use throughout many, many different classes. This was first developed by Dane Rudier in his book, The Lunation Cycle, if that's one of those classics you are familiar with. Jeffrey Green adapted it from Dane Rudier. I adapted it from Jeffrey Green. And back in the early days when I first started studying, Jeffrey had the 0 degrees conjunction right down here. And when I taught his school for 6 years, I go, wait a minute, I'm going to slide it 90 degrees so that the 0 to 360 matches the zodiac 0 to 360 naturally. So that was probably the biggest change that I made in EAN's adaptation to this. And so a couple of little refresher slides here. Life or souls, all species, are always in a continuous state of change or evolution. And we naturally know this through the archetype of Mars, Aries in the first house. In evolutionary astrology, the planet, the sign, and the house are one archetype. And so we know this evolution through that desire nature of Mars, and we identify and then instinctively act upon whatever the desire of the moment is. This is this process that takes a baby from crawling to its first steps, walking, to reach whatever toy mom and or dad are reaching and hanging out towards them. And so this cycle of phases and aspects from 0 to 360 is a complete cycle of evolution. Birth, growth, bloom, decay, death, to rebirth again. So what we point out here is that every planet and point in space is in a phasal relationship to every other planet and point in space. And if we take two planets, for instance, the aspect is always understood from the phasal relationship first. This is what helps take confusion out of aspects. What is the phase? How do you, I'll show you with the screens in a moment here. But we also then point out that an aspect may or may not exist. Two planets will always be in relationship to each other via phase. There may or may not be an aspect between them. Now, just in case, we in EA will start with the planet and go in a clockwise direction to figure out the aspect that the four angles will make to the planet. Now, here is our little slide on determining aspects to planets. You always take the faster moving planet counterclockwise from the slower moving planet. So the faster moving planet becomes the 0 degree point. Go counterclockwise till you get to the faster moving planet. Quick example, Pluto here at 1035 Leo. You take this inner circle, you end up going all the way around the circle to Mercury. So Mercury's making a balsamic conjunction to Pluto. Venus, start with Pluto here, outer circle. Venus's new phase to Pluto, having moved outside the degrees of conjunction. Now, this is different from the 2014-15 classes. About 4 or 5 years ago, 40 years of doing forecasting, I just switched to comparing the sun to the outer planets because we live in a geocentric universe here on Earth. We know sun is the life force giver for everything in existence. However, I started comparing the sun to the outer planets, and you can see the example on your screen with Saturn as the starting point and the sun being balsamic phase to Saturn going all the way around the circle. There's one place where I have differed from Jeffrey's original teachings. There may be another one. If there is, I'll point it out to you. I don't know. I can't think of anything right now. In regards to the nodes, you always start with the planet, but because the mean motion of the nodes is clockwise, you will go in a clockwise direction, and that mean motion of the nodes is retrograde 90% of the time. So in this example here, we start with Uranus, and with the inner circle going in a clockwise direction, the south node is making a waxing opposition, a gibbous phase opposition to Uranus. The north node is start with Uranus all the way around the circle. The north node is a balsamic conjunction to Uranus. Now, there's more detail on these classes as you go through the cycle of phases and aspects classes from either 2014 or 2015. And even with our latest, the Mars-Pluto Planetary series that we just completed doing. Briefly, with Pluto and the process of evolution, there's 4 ways that Pluto affects evolution. 2 are non-cataclysmic, producing or creating that situation in which we form a relationship to something we perceive we need. The new person, the new lover, going to college. Also, producing or creating the situation in which we become aware of a new capacity or capability that has been latent or dormant. Discovering a talent for public speaking. Many times when we have those latent capacities, we will need to use that Pluto will and perseverance to really bring it forward and actualize it again in this life. Now, we can combine the two possibilities as well. I think we can combine non-cataclysmic and cataclysmic as well. The two cataclysmic ways Pluto affects evolution, producing or creating those emotional shocks in which some behavioral pattern or life situation is forcefully removed. Obvious examples: divorce, job loss, a health emergency, up to and including death. It's also done by producing or creating situations in our life in which we become aware of an internal or external source of stagnation or limitation blocking further growth. We become aware of it and we resist the change. And that evolutionary pressure builds and builds and builds until something blows up in our face. And we get the courage to make a big move in our world, and our family doesn't want us to move. And we're like, I don't feel comfortable in this country. I want a new one. And we move. And so there can be varying degrees of crises depending on how well we cooperate with the evolutionary forces. And of course, the cataclysmic possibilities can be combined as well. Now, there's three reactions to the evolutionary impulse: to resist altogether as much as we can tends to be rare; to totally go for it in a non-resistant way, cooperating with the evolutionary impulse, tends to be rare. Most common reaction is our soul is willing to change in some ways. We want to go to school. We want to learn a new craft or trade or talent. Yet we resist changing in other ways due to the fear of the unknown and security patterns. Now, just briefly, a couple of slides on the Pluto and Neptune archetypes. If you're attracted to EA, you're recognizing that Pluto is the archetype of the soul, or what we will call that karmic dynamic or area in which our soul will naturally gravitate for unconscious emotional security reasons. And we know this by looking at the sign that Pluto is in natally. That is the generational lessons and the generation we were born into. And then we will look at Pluto by individual house, and that's where our individual soul gravitates to. I included the Pluto polarity point because it also is part of this story with Pluto. That represents that current life evolutionary intent towards which the soul must evolve and apply its willpower. The polarity point by sign, the generational lessons into the future. The polarity point by house is our individual soul lessons. There are variations of this that we go through in more detail in those early 2014 classes that you can access. And of course, just as we're looking at Pluto by signs, this karmic, dynamic, and evolutionary intent also exists on collective levels, meaning we will have groups of souls that will incarnate specific to certain times on planet Earth in order to learn certain lessons represented by the time period that they were born into. Probably not just with Pluto, but sometimes with the other outer planets making certain transits and relationships / aspects to Pluto as well. Now, Pluto archetype is also the one in which the separating and returning desires within our soul are worked through and decided upon. Separating desires: new lover, car, job, clothes, going to school, going to a concert, taking a vacation. We're continually in process of recognizing a desire, achieving it, momentary sense of satisfaction followed by dissatisfaction, replaced with a new desire. The returning desires is basically the desire to know and merge with universal source. And so we will spend lifetimes naturally exhausting these separating desires until eventually the desire to know source becomes more and more conscious. We continue, though, to exhaust the separating desires on our spiritual path. It's not going off to the monastery or convent. It's the path of the householder, as Jeffrey Green would teach. And then eventually, exhausting even more desires. The only desire left is to know source. The last separating desire to be exhausted is the sexual desire. Excuse me, I have my phone live because I'm expecting a phone call from one of my mom's doctors. You'll hear the phone ring, so sorry for the bouncing beeps. And so that last exhausting desire is sexual. This is because of the procreation desire of the species to actually survive and exist and evolve itself. And on the natural level, approximately 2% of souls, very, very few humans, have naturally exhausted the sexual desire. And I will point out that there can be lifetimes in which we might come in naturally celibate to take a rest, perhaps, from a lifetime where we were forced or chose prostitution or other various sexual scenarios and situations. So it is an extremely rare situation. And when you are exhausting that last separating desire, it is something that you know because of how you've exhausted so much else. So if you're celibate, but you still want the big job, or you still want to just travel all over the world, it can be a clue for you that you've not quite exhausted the separating desires yet. Just a, nuts and bolts on Pluto here. We're not going into details. The Neptune archetype in EA is what we know as the collective conscious and unconsciousness. And I have a tendency to say it's the totality of all consciousness and unconsciousness. It is the totality of every thought, every belief, every emotion that has ever existed since the beginning of manifestation. Now, there are three types of what we call the collective consciousness. Racial. There is a difference between being inherently white versus black versus yellow versus red, using the four native colors. There is also what we would call natural or cultural. If you live here in the United States, there's a difference between being from the northern plains, which is where I'm from, versus being from or living in the southeastern part of the United States versus the northeast. And then there is what we call universal consciousness, which is universal to every single human being as a species, regardless of where we live or regardless of the color of our skin. So when we look at the totality of consciousness, this then also will represent the astrological archetype for universal source, great spirit, God, goddess, whatever you want to call it. Neptune in its rulership of Pisces in the 12th house. The 12th archetype contains all 11 archetypes that came before it. So this is the intent to transcend space and time. This is where our souls have the impulse for a mystical or spiritual experience. It is the desire to find deeper meaning to our life beyond the physical realm. So this then will bring about the archetype of dissolving anything that prevents merging with universal source. And this operates with Neptune through cycles of confusion and clarity. And when we go through that confusion cycle, that is a natural time period to exhaust the desires. Been there, done that. Huh. Can you see how we're already merging Neptune and Pluto? Looking at these individual archetypes. But the confusion cycle is also where we will dissolve fantasies and disillusion, and illusions of grandeur, i.e., I am God. And we are left in that Neptunian void until sooner or later the clarity cycle comes and there is a magical or mystical remerging with source that to us will feel like, oh, life has meaning and value again. Oh, these are the new desires coming out from within me. So even Neptune has a relationship and part of the process of exhausting the separating desires and bringing in the returning desire. Neptune will also include dreams, of which there are three types. Of course, the past life dreams, which can feel very, very disorientating upon waking up. There are also the junk dreams. How many of you binge something on TV and then go to bed and you're dreaming it all night long? Your soul trying to make sense of it and classify it and put it in somewhere for future reference or throwing it away, forgetting it. Superconscious dreams are when we will go to another realm. Can also be quite disorientating dreams too. And so, one more time, this is not the be all end all on these two archetypes, but just briefly giving us an idea. And so, as we look to combined Pluto and Neptune, we are looking at the spiritual evolution of humanity and looking at it throughout history, especially with the slides we're going to look at today. This is going to be, for most of us, this largest cycle to be able to delineate manifestation and meaning in our world. You will see coming up that the Neptune Pluto cycle is approximately 495 years. So it's approximately a 500-year cycle, of which we will have two in each millennium, each 1,000-year time period. And so, as a planetary pair, Pluto and Neptune is the desire to merge with whatever we consider to be that ultimate meaning and value in life. And you can now take that into the context of these different evolutionary states of consciousness within our soul. Consensus, individuated, and spirituated. If you are brand new, I think the first class I taught back in 2014 was the philosophy of evolutionary astrology, and that's where we went into more detail on these three evolutionary states of consciousness. I refer you to those. These evolutionary states of consciousness have a tendency to work within value systems that EA will define as inclusive versus exclusive. Inclusive values are what we know as giving, sharing, and including. And if we go far back in history to the days before the written word, to the days when we lived in more natural law, we recognized it was easier to survive the saber tooth together. There was a natural giving, sharing, and including. And EA then talks about that time period, about 6,500 BC, give or take hundreds of years. Jeffrey Green used to teach about 100 there are about 1,000-year transitions, so from 7,000 to 6,000 BC. In the evolutionary process to manifest, we started to look more and more at exclusive values of taking, hoarding, and excluded. I'm going to keep all the grain for myself and my family so that we have more food to make it through the winter. Bring it forward. It created the whole principle of what we will call fighting and war, because I wanted this spot of land. There was more water there and I could survive better. And so we went through eons of time in which those exclusive principles and values became more important than the inclusive ones. Just take it to today, where we have valued taking, hoarding, and excluding to the point that we are at risk of increasing the number of people who are in poverty or food insecure. We have taken it to the extremes where Gaia, the consciousness of planet Earth, is starting to speak up through Earth events because it's not survivable the way we live anymore. Of course, distortions here are when we take material substitutes and replace them for the inner values. Talking again about the inclusive versus exclusive. And just like we have what we will call these separating and returning desires, we also have what we call the separating and returning forces, what we would call evil and good in religious terms. And what are the separating forces intent on doing? Keeping us separated, maintaining addictions to the material world. And those addictions don't have to be just the physical ones. It can be emotional, mental, and spiritual addictions as well. Not a long enough class to ponder all of this in detail, and I'll speak more to separating and returning forces in just a moment. But what I want to mention next is, as I've been prepping material over the last few days for this series, this is a planetary pair I wanted to teach for a while. I've been going back over some old EA materials, and I found these writings by Jeffrey Green from a book that was probably published in the mid to late 80s. Oh gosh, it was a book that was edited by Noel Till, and it was all about authors who would write chapters on the outer planets. And so Pluto is many times associated with the emotional body. Scorpio 8th house is water, emotions. And so Jeffrey had written a chapter on trauma. And because we're so distorted from natural law, and we look at these big, cycles right now over the next few classes, we can start to come into the concept of trauma. And we'll look at this in next month's class between Pluto and Uranus, because Uranus is the archetype of trauma. And you can just refer to my recent public classes on the 21 forecast, Jupiter in Aquarius, Saturn in Aquarius, or the free Mercury in Aquarius webinar that's going to happen next Monday, January 25th, to understand more trauma. So, types of trauma with the emotional body: betrayal, abandonment, and gross misuse of another person or things through misapplied trust; psychological and sexual abuse, sudden loss, experiencing those cataclysmic events of an individual or collective nature, Pluto, Neptune; anticipation of events that appear to be fated or beyond the control of the individual or group. By the way, from the perspective of EA, any lifetime will have somewhere between 10 to 20% of events that appear fated. And what they are is they are choices made in past lives that will set up a future life with an event or circumstance that appears fated. Just like in this current life, you can make certain choices with individual relationships or circumstances and situations that will appear to set up what will be fated events in a future life. Most extreme example, what elements of fate do you think Donald Trump is setting up in his future lifetimes? Now, Neptune, um, ruling the spiritual body. And yes, it is a water sign and a water house, but due to the previous slides we were looking at, ruling that last of the 12 archetypes, bringing it all together into the spiritual. Some of the trauma associated with Neptune, loss of faith, loss of beliefs, loss of values, massive disillusionment, disassociations from the physical body, addictions, rage collapse syndrome because of unhealthy boundaries. Merging with another and merging with source does not mean we give up healthy boundaries. And sometimes in rare cases, the being possessed by unwanted spirits or energies in non-physical realms. So just touching upon some of these thoughts and ideas for you as you ponder Pluto Neptune as a planetary pair. We're going to move forward here and spend just a little bit of time looking at Pluto Neptune from the perspective of the collective and historical trends. And then we will end this class looking at the Neptune Pluto waxing sextiles that we're probably all aware of. Again, it's approximately a 500-year cycle from conjunction to conjunction. And during that time period, Pluto moves through the zodiac twice. Neptune makes 3 trips approximately. Pluto's zodiacal cycle is 248 years from 0 Aries to 30 Pisces, from 0 to 360. Neptune's cycle is 165 years. What we run into, though, is Pluto has a very elliptical cycle. It variates from that 16-degree band around the ecliptic, that path that the sun follows from our appearance, the appearance of the sun's path from here on Earth, geocentric. It's actually heliocentric, with all the planets going around the sun in a 16-degree wide band. Exception is Pluto, which varies beyond that. And so because of that, and I'm going to give you a visual to it next slide, because of that, Pluto's time through a sign of the zodiac can be as short as 10 to 12 years going to Scorpio, to as long with the polarity Taurus of 30 to 32 years. And so when Pluto is transiting through Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, the 3 fastest transits, it speeds up to kind of traveling the same speed as Neptune, and it can create multiple aspects between Pluto and Neptune wherever they happen to be in a current time period. And I'm speaking long historical time periods. And so what we have right now currently is Neptune making 49 waxing sextiles to Pluto between 1950 and 2032. You'll see as these Pluto-Neptune conjunctions move through the zodiac that when Pluto's in Libra, Scorpio, and Sag, over long eons of time, the multiple aspects with Neptune can be an entirely different aspect. But for us living right now, everyone has Neptune within orb of a waxing sextile to Pluto. moving towards it. If you were born in the 1920s and the 1930s, and you know, many of you are still around, Neptune is moving towards that orb of the waxing sextile. So here's a visual of it, and not the inner planets, but this is just pointing out one of the things that happens between Neptune and Pluto because of Pluto's elliptical orbit. And I have another slide coming that'll show you this. But if we look at, give me a moment here. Here's the sun. If you look at this orbit of Neptune, you see that it is pretty circular. And while all the planets go around the sun in the 16-degree band, we're looking at it flat on. All the planets are pretty circular with the exception of Pluto and the exception of Eris, which we don't have in this example. And in this 500-year cycle, okay, I can ignore this. This is my mom. I'm going through some health stuff with my mother. As we look at their 500-year cycle, there is always a 20-year time period where Pluto goes within the orb of Neptune. And that has a tendency to be in the near time, that Libra, Scorpio, Sag time period. And our backdrop against the constellations, that can change, okay? And Neptune could be over here when Pluto goes within. But this is the most recent time in which Pluto appeared to be closer to the sun than Neptune. And so let's look at this now a little bit more from the perspective of the dates and the degrees. And so here's the dates that Pluto actually appeared to be within Neptune's orbit. February 79 through February 99, Pluto was traveling from 19 Libra to 10 Sag. Neptune was traveling from 20 degrees Sagittarius to 3 degrees Aquarius. And what we can look at this as from an astrological perspective is for that brief period of time, 20 years, spiritual understandings became more of a bottom line for all of us. And as you look at this, you see that Pluto traveling through Scorpio was entirely contained within this. And so it had this energy of intensifying the battle between the separating and returning forces. Pluto traveling through its own sign of Scorpio. And here is where I want to just talk again about the whole, it's called the law of polarity. And so when the unmanifest universal source, great spirit, manifested itself in the Big Bang approximately 14 billion years ago, the first law that came into being was the law of polarity. The law to separate, I exist, I know myself, and the law to return. I want to merge with myself. And so it's not just us who had separating and returning desires. So did Universal Source. And so in addition to the separating and returning desires coming into being, so did separating and returning forces. Now, this is a deep philosophical subject, not quite the time. If you want to, when you are on your account on our website, when you're logged in, just do a word search on the asteroid Lucifer. Just word search Lucifer. It'll bring up some old, I think they're audio files old classes that I did on some Lucifer retrograde transits that will discuss some of that stuff in a little more detail for you. And so the point is that the separating forces, what religion calls evil, the returning forces, what religion calls good, they also go back and forth within themselves. And as I pondered this 20-year time period where Pluto appears to be inside Neptune's orbit, I thought, our spirituality gets the last word. The Pluto's in Scorpio. If you just think about it, Pluto in its own sign, are we going to learn inclusive values or exclusive? I don't think we're done yet. I don't think we're at the kumbaya yet. So I just wanted to briefly point this out to you. And now I want to give you the visual of how it looks. And again, here's Sun way back here, or way in here in the middle. And in this one, you're seeing more of the planets making those natural circles. But here's Pluto at a real bigger angle. And so when it's right here, closest to the sun, perihelion, this is where it appears to be inside of Neptune's orbit. But this blue line, or excuse me, purple line, Pluto, it's so much further out than Neptune. There's no chance that they'll meet each other. Make sense for everybody in regards to that? And by the way, when you have questions, it's perfectly fine to raise your hand or go to the Q&A board. And that's, thank you, Leroy. He's always running the board and typing back answers. And if it's something that needs to be, or that he doesn't quite know or wants my opinion on, then we unmute and we have some live interaction. So you're always welcome to ask questions as you have them through any of our classes. And so, moving on. With the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions, and that conjunction, the 0 degree between any two planets, that's always the beginning of the cycle, all right? So the last time Neptune and Pluto met in Aries, and the first time they met in Aries was about 3500 BCE, before Common Era. We used to say BC, before Christ, and I don't know who did it, probably astronomers. Somebody changed it to before Common Era. And so we had a time period from approximately 3540 BCE to 1071 BCE, where their conjunctions happened in the degrees of Aries. And what we'll see here as we go through these next few slides is every time they have a conjunction, those conjunctions move forward in the zodiac anywhere from 4 to 7 degrees. And so for them to go from their conjunctions with their 500-year cycles, from the beginning of Aries to the end of Pisces, that creates one big mega cycle that takes almost 30,000 years to move through the zodiac. I'm going to show you these dates and degrees in Taurus again. But I just want you to kind of just become aware of this from a broad perspective. We could be living here right now on planet Earth, and the conjunctions could be taking place in Libra or Sagittarius, and we could be ending one of these 30,000 year cycles. Just interesting to ponder for a moment, going back 3,500 years and, the rise of Sumer and Egypt. So more on this as we go along, okay? So these some of these dates and degrees are going to repeat themselves for you. Okay, so when we had those conjunctions in Aries, as I started to say earlier, look at the historical societies that were really starting to flourish and take place. And I missed it on the last slide. I want to point out the source, okay? As I pondered Pluto and Neptune, I thought I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can go on the internet and I can do a search for these cycles and just see what shows up and what comes up. And I ran across this website by an astrologer, and the article, he had two great articles on Neptune, Pluto. They're about 30 years old, but the research was done for me. So I want to give credit to this website and the astrologer, and I'm not quite remembering his name. It's not someone whom I'm familiar with, but um, some of this is my thoughts, but I also want to give this person credit. And so, you know, think back to what we would call megalithic Northwestern Europe. Think back to China during this time period and all of the new beginnings that were starting to take place. And before these Neptune Pluto conjunctions in Aries, they were in Pisces. And we had a lot of mythology, but we really didn't have any written word, any how do you pronounce it? Hieroglyphics, and not only did that start in Egypt, there is the thought that this might have started earlier in Sumer as well. And so think of everything that happened during that time period. Now, turn your thoughts to the Neptune-Pluto conjunctions and 500-year cycles that took place in the sign of Taurus. There were 5 of them. And how we really started, trading back and forth with each other. We created those imperialistic civilizations, excuse me. I'm thinking at this time right now, and I'm thinking of Taurus and that distortion of possessiveness with Taurus, and this is my stuff. No, this is my stuff. And, we had 10,000 years to figure out how to go from being nomadic to agricultural and grow the grain so we could survive better. And I want the food. No, I want the food. And if you've ever watched series of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and looked at the historical clothing and food and gold, it might seem medieval compared to what we have today, but they were really flourishing in some areas with food, clothing, and shelter, which is Taurus, which was the intent of these Neptune Pluto cycles. And so the author of this information felt that when the Neptune Pluto conjunction switched to Gemini in the late 1300s, there were actually some timings between the ending of what we would call the medieval times or the Dark Ages in Europe, that first 1,000 years, if you want to think about that in the common area, CE. And then we started what we would call the Renaissance. Oh, nope, before that. Before we go into that, I want to point out one particular Neptune Pluto cycle, and specifically the conjunctions, the ones that came in the late or early 500s going backwards, minus 500 BCE. This one stood out, and you may have read little articles about this because in this particular conjunction with Neptune and Pluto, there was only one, okay? As you can see on your screen, 9-degree Taurus. But what happened during this time period, there was a triple conjunction with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You can see the degrees and the dates on your screen here. And in addition to that triple conjunction of the three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in Taurus, it was also a time period for a few years where Saturn opposed Uranus, and then it opposed Pluto, and then it opposed Neptune. So if you think about this time period, Neptune-Pluto is a 500-year cycle. Uranus-Neptune is a 172-year cycle. Uranus-Pluto is a 127-year cycle. There were 3 cycles that were bunched together right there. And so this time period was loosely thought of, and you'll hear it written of as minus 600 BCE. Here's the actual date. This time period was loosely known as a time period of religious rebirths and great thought ideas. Look at the individuals who lived during that time period. Lao Tzu, I don't know how to say it, Confucius, Buddha, Zoroaster, Muhammad, all of our Greek philosophers, the Old Testament Jewish writers, and it was also happening over in the North American and South American civilizations. They just didn't have the markings or written words like we did. But you can just see how they really initiated this triple conjunction with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. It initiated a time period of mega growth around the world in our abilities to survive on the planet. Now, we'll move into these conjunctions that started in Gemini. And the first one you can see on your screen was 1398 to 99. This is kind of, again, loosely known as the time period of the Renaissance in Europe, or Enlightenment that went for many, many generations. And so it was also a time period with a lot of travel that became initiated by sea. We in the late 1300s, early 1400s, our ships learned how to sail around the world and discover new continents or new worlds. If you live in the United States, you grew up with Christopher Columbus discovering America in 1492. Well, guess what? They discovered these new worlds a lot earlier than that. That's just the one that made it into the history books for everybody to be taught. And so we started in Europe and went all the way around the world in one Neptune-Pluto cycle. See things speeding up. Now, the conjunctions taking place in Gemini will last until the 3800s. So we're actually just in the beginning of the Pluto, Neptune, Gemini intentions. When 2 planets meet together at 0 degrees and birth a new cycle, that's the seed thoughts, that's the intentions that are then germinated and growing and flourished and blooming to then die off through the whole 360 cycle together. And in regards to Neptune, Pluto, we have multiple cycles again in these same signs. So here's another one to take a look at from a little bit deeper or broader perspective to point out. And this was the conjunctions that happened in the late 1300s in the early degrees of Gemini. And again, this was the first conjunction of Neptune and Pluto in Gemini. But at that time period that we had the Neptune-Pluto conjunctions, this time Uranus and Saturn were opposing Neptune and Pluto. So you can see the years and the degrees on your screen. We had, look right here, the Neptune-Pluto conjunctions were 3 times in Gemini in the late 1300s. Before that, Uranus made 9 oppositions to Neptune, all in Scorpio Taurus. Uranus made 5 oppositions to Pluto between the last degree of Scorpio, Sag, to then having them in you get the point. I'm not going to say this, blah, blah, blah. Neptune followed, Saturn followed, opposing Neptune 3 times, both in Scorpio, Taurus, and Sag, Gemini. Then Neptune opposed Pluto 3 times in Sag, Gemini. And of course, I went, oh gosh, we got to have a Saturn conjunction to Uranus as well if they're hanging out together. And so the same year that Neptune was having conjunctions to Pluto at 3 degrees, here was Saturn Uranus conjunctions between 12 and 14 degrees of the opposite sign. So as you look from our prior screen when we said this, these were the first conjunctions of Neptune and Pluto in Gemini. Now can you see even more how this was the beginning of the Renaissance or that Enlightenment period in Europe, and then traveling further and further around the world, spreading it in some ways and conquering exclusive forces in other ways. And also remember what happened in the early 1400s, 500-year cycle. You kind of got to spread out that phases. Remember those 8 phases? You know, Neptune's going to be new phase Pluto for quite a while, laying those seed thoughts and germinating them. Printing press came in the early 1400s. Can't remember the date exactly. Leroy, Google it and put it up there. I didn't think of doing that. I want to say like 1415, something like that, really early, or maybe 1440, something like that. But look at what the printing press, Gemini, to humanity. All of a sudden, you didn't need the priest to read the Bible to you. You could learn to read and read it for yourself. And we didn't only start publishing, the Bible, we started publishing all kinds of things. We started being able to publish a map of the world or maps of different countries. So you can see how we had, the initiation of this first conjunction in Gemini, such an explosion of information that started to take place that even now we're still working to make sense of. I don't know if he's hearing me, but I'm going to move on for us, okay? And so this brings us to the most recent conjunction we had with Pluto and Neptune. These are the ones that took place, 3 of them, in 1891-92, between 7 to 9 degrees Gemini. And here again, I borrowed words from this website just to make some key points for ourselves. Did you unmute yourself, Media Monk?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm multitasking, so I had unhooked my USB cord
Oh,
from the tower.
sorry.
So at 1440, Johannes Gutenberg in 1440 in Strasbourg,
14.
France.
I knew there was another 40 in or 4 in it. In France, huh? I didn't
Strasbourg,
remember
France.
where.
And 10 years later, that printing machine had been perfected so well, mechanically and commercially, that they could use it for commercial printing, making papers and stuff.
Yeah. Yep, I knew that it was just such a major moment. And I'm going to do something right here with my calculator here. 500 divided by 8 equals, it means that Neptune new phase Pluto lasts about 65 years. And so that printing press was developed and brought into being while Neptune was still new phase Pluto here, even though they may have both moved on into different signs themselves. You get the point of how the seed thoughts are generated by the signs of conjunctions.
Can I rubber
So,
band us forward on a question on the board?
yep.
I had my own read on this, but a student wanted you to comment upon the impact of Pluto being inside that Neptunian orbit for that period in the 80s and 90s. What's
Mm-hmm.
your read on that for the group? What significance or what did that mean?
Well, again, it was what I said on the slides. There was a 20-year time period where Neptune appeared, quotes, to be the outermost orbit with Pluto. So Neptune gets the last word. So Neptune gets the last word with the spiritual understandings. And if let's just use one example relative to current time periods. How many of you remember the 80s and that Me First generation? And we were various other cycles, but we were just exploding with materialism. And we continued with that into the 90s. And yet, how well were we speaking up from an ethical perspective of that material explosion on planet Earth and the effects it was having on Earth? That was also the time period when you were really beginning to see the talks about climate change. Yes, we were doing it back then. Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, I want to say that book was written in the 1960s with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo. It was published back then. But it was in those 1980s that we really started to hear that phrase, global warming. And so there could be all kinds of themes you can take from that, all right? But as we were in that time period of Neptune appearing outermost for 20 years, we had Pluto in Scorpio. We had Pluto through the first 10 degrees of Sag. And Pluto in Scorpio, as I said earlier as well, that was that battle between our separating and returning desires, between separating and returning forces. That was that time period, Pluto in Scorpio, when we had AIDS, HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, and it was a retrovirus, an RNA virus that attached itself to our RNA and then became unique to each person. And so we couldn't come up with the fast vaccine for it. And that time period, Pluto in Scorpio, with that mutation of HIV. And again, you can have FIV, feline immunodeficiency virus. You can have CIV, canine immunodeficiency virus, B, bovine. There can be multiple species that have these immunodeficiency viruses. Pluto rules viruses, bacteria, fungi, and prions. Prions, incomplete proteins that accumulate in tissues and organs of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And so that time period, HIV, this was almost like Mother Nature, okay, going, excuse me, wait a minute, humans, you think you're the boss. You think your will of your soul, Pluto and Scorpio can do it, but Neptune is going to have, a little bit of that last word here if you're not paying attention. All right. And then during that time period, hold on a second, I got to get my slides. I'm going back to my slides rather than changing them. Okay. Neptune was traveling from 20 Sag to 3 degrees Capricorn or Aquarius. So we had Neptune's entire Capricorn transit, which with HIV really, if you lived through that time period, remember how it really brought about a spiritual crisis, Neptune and Capricorn, about survivalism.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
HIV is going to spread all over the planet, and it was a little bit of a wake up call
Sure.
if we reflect back on that.
Especially because it affected us on intimate levels, and how deep emotional intimate levels. Pluto and Scorpio, and Neptune and Capricorn comes along and gives us the reality check that allowed us to understand that our spiritual work was the most serious thing instead of all the scorpionic drama.
Well, and it was survival, really. I mean,
Survival.
species survival, and it brought up all the sexuality issues
Mm-hmm.
and the Neptune Capricorn distortions of that would be, you know, suppressing sexuality. And remember how they tried to tie it all on to homosexuality?
Oh yeah, we went through the just say no phase, just like
Yep. So again, we could springboard into many subjects. All right. The point is for that brief time period, Neptune, last word. And so ponder the subjects and then go forward and from there. All righty. So if you want to quickly reading these trends, back in the 1800s, remember the Gilded Age? We started having the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the whoever they are and were in Europe. The first really big millionaires. Big capital. So many corporations were coming through. And then we also had the rise of socialism over in Europe. Really had explosions of growth in cities. And we were going into the last corners of the world, Gemini, with exploration. And, who knows all the various different ways we were doing it beyond just sailing ships across the water. Here's some of the inventions that came in that decade: automobiles, airplanes, electricity, frozen canned foods, plastic, x-rays, photography, discovery of oil, advertising, radio mass media. We started figuring out how to build skyscrapers and create pharmaceuticals. These were the beginnings of nuclear physics, New Age beliefs, spiritualism, theosophy. Anybody? Remember socialism and feminism really starting to take off with electoral democracy in various independence movements. You can just see how, reflecting back on this with a little bit of time, the various seed thoughts that were laid with these conjunctions between Neptune and Pluto. And we're not through. We're just starting this cycle. We're now looking at the waxing sextiles. Neptune 60 degrees beyond Pluto. And so they're crescent phase with each other, but we're into the waxing sextile. Now, I didn't publish the dates because for most of you, that is something you can look up in an ephemeris that you can Google. What I wanted to point out, though, was that these 49 waxing sextiles from 1950 to 1932, we're talking an 80-year time period here, and this is again that elliptical orbit of Pluto. There were 3 sets of them together. We had from 1950 to 1956, 15 sextiles, Neptune Libra, Pluto Leo. Then 1976 to 86, we had 21 sextiles. And Neptune was in Sag and Capricorn. Pluto was in Libra and Scorpio. And then finally, you can see we have 13 more waxing sextiles coming up of Neptune to Pluto before Neptune moves beyond this aspect. And Neptune will be in Aries and Pluto will be in Aquarius. Now, here's where we're going to shift into more personal evolutionary understandings of this. But before we do, I just want to speak about the 60-degree waxing sextile in general. Decisions and choices made at the waxing sextile, which is crescent or yin phase, will have an impact throughout the rest of the planetary cycle together. This can be of a positive or negative nature, and it can be of separating or returning energies. So this is Mercury waxing sextile to Mars, and it'll have an effect on their annual cycle together. This can be Jupiter waxing sextile Saturn. We just had the 0-degree conjunction. And when Jupiter gets to that waxing sextile to Saturn, choices made are going to then reflect the remaining years of that 20-year cycle. And so this is something that you rarely hear spoken about or taught in general astrology, yet this is germane to EA. And I have memory. I have waxing sextiles in my chart. I have more than a few. And so I picked up on this in my early studies in the Jeffrey Green cassette tape typewriter days, dating myself here. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it was something I never forgot. And so this is important. And now look at this from the perspective of Neptune Pluto. So all those seed thoughts from the 1890s and 7 to 9 degrees Gemini, we've now reached that half a trine, ease of effort, ease of resistance. I'm going to put that in the PowerPoint slide. That's another phrase that we use for sextiles. Ease of effort, ease of resistance. Think of how these 49 waxing sextiles have such a huge long-term effect during their 80-year time period with this aspect. So all of these desires that have been born of the 1890s and early 1900s, they're coalescing and condensing into new forms based upon evolving beliefs, values, meanings. So just look at that 1979 to 1999 time period again, and how the climate change, the whole issue with mutations of viruses. Just two subjects. Look at everything in our life right now and how Neptune waxing Pluto. I mean, to me, I've always looked at it, and it's going to be germane to your Neptune and Pluto signs and specific to your Neptune Pluto houses, at how we all individually are at choice points with our spiritual growth and evolution, regardless of evolutionary state of soul. It's still happening for all of us on some level. What do we value? And of course, all we got to do is get in all the Aquarius archetypes and recent, classes and conjunctions. And, are we going back to yesterday or are we evolving forward tomorrow? Stay tuned. We'll bring the good old Uranus Neptune planetary pair again into next month's class. So now what I want to look at specifically for us is these waxing sextiles specific to Pluto generations and Neptune generations. Do you remember that we said Neptune takes 165 years to go around the zodiac? So Neptune spends 14, 15 years in each sign of the zodiac. That is its own mini generation in regards to collective beliefs on soul levels. And so if we look at those waxing sextiles from 1950 to 56, we had the Pluto in Leo generation. And remember, we had the Neptune in Libra generation. And so on broad perspectives, this is the Pluto Leo generation having to open up to relationship equality. Having to recognize the world doesn't revolve around them, a famous Pluto Leo archetype. They're having to learn how to share creativity with others, co-creating, including with universal source, Neptune and Libra. They're learning how to honor the divine in another human with healthy boundaries, Neptune, Libra, equally giving and receiving. They're learning to honor the diversity, Libra, of relationships as co-equals. So this even goes beyond intimate relationships, Libra. It goes Libra squares to Cancer and Capricorn, family and career. You can even bring in relationships. Libra is that diversity of relationships, comparing and contrasting to who am I and who I am not. So you see these broad symbols of having to learn how to get along as a co-equal. And boy, oh boy, all you have to do is look at the state of planet Earth. And we got a lot of Pluto in Leos alive. And we got a lot of Pluto in Leos running a lot of countries, not to mention corporations. And you can just see the exclusive distortions alive and well. I just put in a few keywords here. Relationship codependencies, anybody? Neptune, Libra. Idealizing our partners, projecting onto those partners, especially projecting ideals onto them, and then having the disillusionment when those partners fall off their pedestals. Neptune and Libra can self-sacrifice, give with unhealthy boundaries, and then wonder why they hurt, why they're angry, why the partner doesn't give in return. learning to give and receive as co-equals. Can you see how there can be controlling of others in relationships? Can you see how there can be an expectation that others will treat them fairly, and then again, all the disappointments when they do? We could go through many PowerPoint slides expanding on several of these concepts and ideas. My intent here is to just have one slide that can spark for you in your own chart. Now apply this to where your Pluto Leo house is or your Neptune Libra house is. Spark on this for yourself or with clients if you work with them, or family members if you work with them. And so moving on, we then had the sextiles from 1976 to 1984. A little bit shorter, but we ended up the tail end of the Pluto Libra generation and the beginning of the Pluto Scorpio generation. So here we had Pluto Libra and Neptune in Sagittarius. And so the Pluto Libra generation was, or is, will be, opening up to relationship honesty, equality, and a deepening of spiritual values. And Pluto Libra, one more reminder. Yes, this is intimate, but take it beyond intimate. Bring in the squares of family, Cancer, and career, co-workers, bosses, employees, Capricorn. So we're learning to speak up, Pluto Libra, directly and honestly, Neptune and Sag, through differences in beliefs and values. Learning to trust the right brain with our intuitive messages that we receive, Neptune and Sag. Pluto Libra wants to rationalize it away, talk it through until they don't trust what came through anymore. So in addition to that, we have to act upon the intuition. Both Libra and Sag are active polarity, energy moving out from the center. So we can't just think about it or talk about it. We have to do something. And this is a generation then that's also going to be called to live a more natural lifestyle. Neptune and Sag, according to their evolving belief systems. What if you're in a relationship with a partner who wants to live in the big city concrete skyscrapers, and you just have dreams of, a little house out in nature that has a little creek of water running through it? Boy, there's quite a difference in values there. Are you going to do the Pluto Libra compromising until you just don't even live your value systems or beliefs anymore? How can there be some compromising? Does it create a Y in the road? Remember those important choices with waxing sextiles? So, a few of the distortions. You ignore intuitive hits about relating inequalities. Pluto Libra, who's doing all the giving? Who's doing all the taking? Dominating, dominated. We can take it to participating in relating extremes of domination, dominating. We can project divine energies, Neptune and Sag, Pluto and Libra, onto relationships with, again, the inevitable disillusionment here. We can also assume Neptune and Sag that our personal truth is the universal truth, the whole truth, the blah, 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 so help me God, whatever that consensus saying is, that you take when you're going to be on the witness stand in the courts of the U.S. And we might have some disillusionment to wake up that, what we think is truth for us, and it may be truth for us, but it may be only a minute fraction of universal principles and laws. Neptune and Sag. We can have all kinds of living lies. Pluto Libra, I call them sometimes the distortions are karma chameleons. Who should I be in order for you to like me? I'm going to live the lie in order to be in this relationship. And then we can have the whole principle of lying to ourselves and others to appear more noble or pure or greater than what we actually are. And of course, that can lead to it just kind of blowing up in our face when the lies are exposed. So for these waxing sextiles, and again, use the orbs. How well do you walk your talk? How authentic can you be? And then we also have here the beginnings of that Pluto and Scorpio generation relating to the Neptune and Capricorns. And here we have to open up to relationship, practicality, and realism. Now, Pluto and Scorpio, this is intimate relationships. So, in general, we have to learn how to cooperate with family, society, career, and life. Neptune and Capricorn. Cooperation, Pluto and Scorpio merging. We have to learn how to acknowledge the reality of the circumstances in our life, Neptune and Capricorn, and then make the effort, Capricorn, Scorpio, to evolve. Scorpio. I sometimes talk about Pluto and Scorpio distortions as power over, power under. And so when you look at the Taurian polarity of self-reliance, it leads you to empower yourself and then empower others. And this is what's going to happen with these waxing sextiles right here. And of course, with Neptune, it's learning that self-responsibility comes with healthy boundaries. Neptune and Capricorn, I have to be ultimately responsible for myself. I have a phrase for Neptune, Pisces, and 12th. Ultimate self-responsibility creates ultimate freedom. Capricorn can borrow the phrase. And of course, healthy boundaries, Pluto and Scorpio, that desire to merge those extremes of codependency that can come in intimate relationships as well as others with the Pluto and Scorpio generation. So you can see some of the distortions here. The good old end justifies the means for both archetypes. The extremes of power plays and manipulations to control all kinds of relationships and our environment, including career, from both archetypes. And Neptune and Capricorn, being controlled by guilt and depression. A natural archetype of Capricorn is depression. It turns us inward to ask, what's wrong? What's not working? What needs to change? And of course, Capricorn is also the archetype of conditioned guilt, those consensus standards of right, wrong conduct that cause us to feel guilty if we deviate. So we can have natural guilt here, we can have conditioned guilt here. How are you opening up, waxing sextile, and moving through it? And this natural and conditioned guilt can be conscious and unconscious. It can go deep with both Pluto, Scorpio, and Neptune, Capricorn. And it can cause us to need to do deep, deep reflections in order to then discern. You know, EA's teachings is that anywhere from I gotta reach into my left brain for a moment here. You know, anywhere from 80 to 90% of guilt is conditioned.
And those are, feel that loosely, go anywhere from 70 to 90% of guilt is conditioned guilt from the mass consensus that, tries to condition conformity. And if we're caught up in that, we can really create cycles of despair and an inability to take charge of our life. So, how can we acknowledge those circumstances and make that effort to evolve? How can we take up that self-responsibility? How can we apply that will to make it better for ourselves and others? So finally, looking forward. These little souls haven't even been born yet. But I thought, okay, I better put it in there. Somebody's going to ask someday and down the road if this PowerPoint slide lives or PowerPoint webinar lives into the ethers. So these are going to be sextiles from 26 to 32. And this is where the Pluto and Aquarius generation with Neptune in Aries, brand new 165-year cycle evolving our belief systems. This generation has to open up to new belief systems based upon equality in all areas of life. Just think about Neptune in Aquarius, think about 21, think about Saturn in Aquarius, 21, 22, and then think about Pluto going into Aquarius, 2023 for the next 2 decades. Think about all the areas that we are going to have to look at inequality and how do we metamorphose it. So learning that the safety and well-being of the individual is intrinsically tied to the collective, to the well-being of all of us. Saying that differently in a religious sense, what you do to the least of us, you do to all of us. Learning to honor the unity in diversity, learning to honor the differences, Aquarius. And how can we each be ourselves, Neptune in Aries, and the freedom to do that, the freedom to follow our own path and personal truths. Learning new paths of individualization. It's both Aquarius and Aries on a changing planet. Wait till you see how things speed up with Pluto and Aquarius, especially if we're not addressing the big, broad issue of climate change on a global level. Learning to honor in that regard all species on planet Earth, the well-being of the individual as well as the collective. Well, how about the well-being of the four-leggeds in addition to the two-leggeds? How about the well-being of all the fish in all the oceans? Do they get to survive and flourish? What are our beliefs around that? And of course, from a distortion perspective, we can look at race and social inequalities, me versus you and us versus them, mentalities, Aquarius, and beliefs, Neptune. You see it just busting forth in the United States right now, as well as other countries around the world. How will this unfold over these next few years and this next decade as Pluto goes into Aquarius? How will this generation grow up over the next 50, 60, 70 years? Great disillusionment, Neptune, that all people do not act fairly. Aquarius, extremes of selfishness and denial of others' rights, and Neptune in Aries can bring about insecurities and identity crises. And if that happens, then it really creates more of that exclusionary me versus you and us versus them. By the way, Neptune goes into Aquarius 2025-26. Neptune will have one retrograde cycle, dipping back into Pisces and then going into Aquarius for another 15 years. Pluto will have two retrograde cycles, going into Aquarius, dipping back into Capricorn, 2023-24. All righty, that's my last slide. And so here's the series we're going to look at. And we ended up going 2 to 4 Mountain Time today because neither one of us caught the fact that we're going to move these up. In the future months, starting next month, we're going to move these classes up an hour from 1 to 3 due to a conflict with my other work, my evolutionary or my energetic balancing. So here's the planetary pairs that you see. At the moment, I'm not, so many of our monthly classes you will see use volunteer charts. At the moment, I'm not planning to because these are some big cycles that we're starting out with, and I'd rather give you some major aspects and planetary trends that are valuable for all of us as we start to go forward. We'll play with it when we get to the inner planets. I may change my mind. And so at this point, I guess I would just see if there are any questions from those of you who are live. You can type questions into the Q&A panel. You can raise the little hand symbol and ask them live if you are muted, or I mean, if you are connected with a headset in some way. I guess I'll check in with you, Leroy. Any comments, questions from you?
Nope, couple comments on the board, but and questions that we've answered. So thanks for
Okay,
doing all the research. It was I really like the way you took the sextiles around the zodiac. That was really nice and very relevant for everybody to get their chart out and take a peek.
sure, sure. Well, let me just finally say then that when you get the PDF, whenever you see a hyperlink in blue, you can actually click on that and it will take you directly to a various page on our website. And so I just recently did Jupiter in Aquarius. That's available on our website. I didn't list Saturn in Aquarius. Last spring I did Saturn in Aquarius and I think I did a 2-part series, but I can't remember. I think Leroy has that half price right now. And of course we just did the 21 forecast, which you can go get, and then look for the email newsletter that is going to come out, and you can register for our free pay it forward Mercury retrograde webinars. And so this
I
one's going
just
to be in Aquarius.
Yeah, I just sent that one out. So that there was we usually don't have a hard time building a big audience for a free webinar. So I did send out an email earlier in the day. I also included in that email a new expanded EA intro workshop for those novices or beginners to astrology that kind of to introduce. We use these pay it forwards to kind of bring new people into the EA pipeline, so to speak. So thank you for passing them along. When you get that email, pass it along to all your colleagues in your address book, I guess, and invite them to join us.
And I want to say one more thing. For those of you who have purchased the segment 2 materials, as we've combined the health and wellness into that, the last 6 months of 2020 was pretty intense for Leroy and I. between us, we lost 3 family members in 4 months. The last one being my father due to an accident literally 2 months ago. And so it has kind of taken my schedule and created chaos. I still have projects in some PDFs for the health and wellness that I will make available to everyone in segment 2 as I get my chance to work on those and streamline them and make them more timely and efficient. And then as I do that, I've also had some evolving ideas on just a few winter classes that I wanted to do on health and wellness in segment 2. So I've got those listed. I just don't have the timing for them quite yet, nor do I have the subject titles quite yet. They've been germinating for a while, but I just want to say thank you for your patience with me as the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto stellium is in the first few degrees of my first house, 21 and a half Capricorn ascendant. I have to be a little spontaneous and flexible right now. I'm now working through health issues with my mother, serious but not drastic. And I just have to be a little flexible with my schedule. So stay tuned. We will definitely send out the emails as we move forward with everything. Again, just thank you for understanding. I have wanted to teach this Neptune Pluto planetary pair class for probably the last 2-3 years. And so I'm just happy to have created it, taught it, and shared it with you for posterity.
Yeah, so and from Media Monk's perspective, we have several pages under construction on the website, but as you can tell, we're on about version 12 of our website over the last 20 years. So everything is an evolution at Evolutionary Astrology Network.
And if you notice a link doesn't work, contact MediaBug.
Yeah, please do. Your feedback is real important, particularly as you go through the registered associates area. You know, sometimes the posts, unless you copy and paste correctly, you know, or yeah. So just feel free
Well,
to
didn't our
send me.
programmer completely update the back end in the last month or 2?
A lot easier to navigate and a lot easier for me to continue to make changes without a programmer. So yeah, you know, we live in a great world. You know, that we talked about the printing press at 1440. Here we are at 2040, and I think we're going to be just fine getting the information out to everybody. But let us know if you see something wrong.
All right. Thank you, everyone. All the best until next month.